right. Hello, everyone. I am Sam Melnick, the Vice President of Customer Success here at Allocadia, and I'm joined today by Richard Waslinchuk. I think I got that one right, Richard,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Yeah. So today we're talking about marketing ROI. It's Basecamp to Everett, Journeys to ROI. Earlier this week, we talked with Lori West, who's at Genpack, and today we get to be graced by Richard's presence, who is the VP of Revenue Operations at Visier. I'm going to hand it over to Richard in a second to do a better introduction and overview of his background, but I just want to spend a minute or hopefully a minute or so talking about ROI in general. So, I think one thing is why we're excited about having multiple speakers here is that the reality when it comes to marketing or like revenue ROI, it's not a one-size-fit-all approach. Each organization is going to have slightly different to very different journey, but we can still learn from experts like Richard and Lori about what worked, what didn't, how they approached it, and how we can take that into our own, journeys to ROI. So that's why we have Richard. You can go back and watch Lori as well. Allocadia also has a bunch of other content around ROI and different perspectives there. But like today, we're going to be chatting with Richard. So why don't you, Richard? I'll stop rambling. You can start giving your background and a little bit of overview of yourself, your role, and Visier as a whole.
Sure. So I'm with a company called Visier. We are in the HR analytics space, and I head up our revenue operations function, which we are approaching that as very much a cross-functional group that is looking at operations, analytics, tech, process efficiencies, all those fun things. My background is in marketing. So I came up and grew up in marketing, originally in demand generation. Although before that, I was a graphic designer, a web developer. So, an interesting journey to get here. But, earlier on in my career, I spent a lot of time working through programs and such on the marketing side. I've been with Visier now for coming up on 8 years. It is a high growth tech company. So with that lens, I've seen a lot of growth, and that journey around ROI has changed significantly from when I started with the company to where we are today. So lots of learnings along the way, lots of things to share. It's been fun.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I'm going to come back to RevOps and how you look at it, but you've kind of led us to the initial question. What does ROI look like for the business? And even maybe a peek into how that iterations have happened over the years.
Yeah, I think it's not a simple question. So, I think a lot of people are off the cuff, what's the return on that investment? And I really think it's that step back around what is the objective, what's the intent behind what you're doing. And I think that's a lot of what the complexities are inside of marketing is there are multiple intents behind what we're doing. And then there's multiple touch points across the entire journey. So it's very hard to simplify and say that program that I just ran gave me X dollars in pipeline. It could have had impact downstream. It could have been something that we were doing from a brand or an awareness perspective that, the intent wasn't to yield pipeline. So it really comes down to that step back to understand really like what is the intent behind what you're doing, and then how are you going to measure that to provide the insights back to the business on how performance is looking.
That's great, and we talk about this, and I think you and I have talked about this in the past, and I think Lori and I talked about it earlier this week, but this idea of intent or return on intent, and not the intent data that you can buy from a vendor, but the idea that one, there's not a end-all be-all ROI metric. I wish there was, but there's not. But two, it's almost like ROI is in the eye of the beholder, but it's up to the campaign, the campaign manager, the channel manager, whomever, the VP, to determine, hey, I've got this money. What am I intending to do with it, and what is the intended output of it? And I think that's an important point. When you has that always been the way you or Visier has looked at the world, or how is that? How have you gotten to that point where that's how you think about ROI?
The simple answer is no. Like, we've not always thought of it that way, and 8 years is a long time at a company. So 8 years is a long time in life in general. So if I think about the environment 8 years ago, just in general, not specific to Visier, a lot of people 8 years ago were there were conversations around attribution, but it really, not a lot of people were really doing it or doing it well. And I think 8 years ago, it was just a really simple approach. For us, like, we were a very small business at that point in time, so there's not a lot that you can do around the complexity of the buyer journey, attribution, all that kind of stuff. So we very much looked at, if we're investing money, is it growing the database? So where are we generating new names to the database? And then we're looking at last touch to pipeline. We have very long sales cycles as well. So that's another layer of complexity for us. What you're spending today probably isn't going to yield revenue for another year. So when you're trying to talk about my budget this year and really how did it perform, you kind of have to make some assumptions. You got to sort of look to pipeline and then circle back in the following year to see, well, did it really yield revenue? But early days, it really was like, what was growing the database? What programs were that last touch before pipeline generation? So that we understood, are we growing the database for the business? And then of the marketing programs that we were running, what was really touching accounts before pipeline was generated?
So what I really liked about what you just said was that it's iteration, but it's also like, what questions are we trying to answer? Like, you wanted to grow the database, so are we growing the database? And you wanted to make sure marketing's campaigns were creating pipeline that, once that handoff to sales happened,
yeah,
20% win rate or whatever it was, that you were providing the right amount, and you set up your metrics in that way. And I think that's something that people, kind of an early step that they miss when it comes to ROI or any metrics. It's like, what are the decisions that you need to support? And how do you architect that?
Well, and like, what is the business strategy, right? Early days, it was like, we need to grow the database, right? We need that gold in the database to mine. Which now it's a completely different story. We've got a very large database. And we've got a very complex buying committee. We've got a lot going on. So now, the strategy is, how do we understand that to better guide the business and build on that strategy of selling more.
And how has the functional data and technology changed to support your ROI approach over the years?
Ooh, that's a big question. So we have our tech stack has evolved over time. Early days when we didn't need that complexity, like, you could get by with your marketing automation platform, your CRM, to really kind of understand the basics. As you start to get a little bit more complex and measure journeys, that's how we've evolved into attribution. So, we have set up some models to understand, attribution to pipeline and then full journey, so that we get a better understanding of all the different marketing touch points. So early days, lead generation, what's last touch on pipeline. Now we kind of look at it knowing and understanding that, there may be 10 marketing touch points before we yield pipeline. So what are those? What are the most important ones? What are, what's driving those milestone positions? And that starts to uncover like a different layer. So, what actually is driving first touch, lead create, opportunity create. Because what you want to do is, you don't want to make decisions based on just one of those slices, because that can have that impact or potentially a negative impact downstream. If you pull something that's really generating leads, that may have an impact on what's going on from your opportunity create touch point. So it's a different way of thinking. And then, like, to your point, like, we've had to layer on technology to understand that. We've had to, transform the way that we're using our existing technology, whether it be through, different segmentation structures. Attribution was, I would say, the biggest one in terms of understanding that journey.
That's great. Thank you. Do you mind sharing your kind of ROI tech stack, which technologies you're using?
So we are Marketo Salesforce. We use Visible. We have recently purchased Demandbase as well, which is giving us a different lens on how we look at our funnel. So we are trying to make that shift towards an account funnel versus a person funnel. A lot of what a lot of that evolution in terms of ROI was really understanding the holistic picture of what's going on in an account. The attribution model and with Visible that we use for attribution, that kind of broke down the silo of looking at specific people and what was happening with the person. And now we get like that holistic understanding of what actually is the activity at the account level. So Demandbase is sort of layering on top of that to give us an account view. And I'm probably missing like a ton of other things.
Allocadia, of course.
Oh, Allocate! Oh my god!
I'll make sure I send the gift before next time instead of after.
I'm clearly not caffeinated enough this morning. I should have led with Allocadia. So Allocadia is definitely a foundation of that. We've taken advantage of a number of new features that you guys have released. So pushing a lot of our cost data into Salesforce so that we've got it on campaigns to understand what was budgeted, what was planned, the actuals, and then having that map back to understand really was it yielding, again, depending on what the intent was, did it yield the performance or the result that we were looking for.
Great, thank you. Yes.
That was a miss on my part there.
Oh, it's all right. That's what I'm here for. I don't have to make jokes about it, and yeah. Talk to me about, so one thing that we talked about with Lori, and I talked with other customers about it, it's like metadata or consistent taxonomies as you're connecting these different technologies, whether it's Allocadia or Salesforce or Marketo or business. Like as an ops leadership position, someone's been doing this for a while, how do you think about that consistency across your data and your technologies?
Oh, it's paramount. So if you don't have that consistency, you are going to struggle. I think the challenges that I've seen in the last couple of years is as businesses grow very quickly, a lot of that metadata will shift. So whether it's a different way that you want to structure campaigns, if it's different tactics that we're coming in with, a lot of that metadata or the structure of that metadata will change over time. So it's critical that if you are making those changes, that you are thinking about that data strategy across all of your tech in your tech stack. And if not, that's where you start to go down a slippery slope of siloed tech that doesn't talk to each other, that you're really not able to make sense of really what's happening. And then you're on the journey of hiring a data scientist to pull everything out of every system into a data mart and then do the analysis. So it really is paramount to understanding what's going on, to have that metadata and the strategy around it and consistency.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. And I think, like, to me, we talked about like what are those questions you're trying to answer, and then it's like what's the metadata or the taxonomy to help you answer that. Because where I see marketers and customers struggle, or at least slowing them down considerably, is where they have to go backwards from, hey, we want to bring all this together, and they're like, oh, we don't have the data structure or the questions answered. At what point do you recommend people have that conversation around metadata with the understanding that it might shift too?
Yeah, I mean, I think it always has to be part of the conversation. I don't think, like what you described of having to go back, like I don't think you can ever avoid that just because things move and change so quickly. So I think it's really around alignment and understanding. I think Sometimes that's the challenge being in an ops role is you know, those conversations outside of the ops function where people don't quite understand the value of the metadata or the why. So that's always a challenge where you need to get that alignment and educate people as to the why you need that metadata.
That makes sense. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point too. Like it's an iterative process. You want to have the conversation, but you also, it's not a set it and forget it. Ideally, it's
No.
iterative versus throwing everything out and restarting.
Yeah, yeah. Because I think a lot with metadata is, you know, it's important, but depending on the cadence of how you're reporting and what you're looking at, you may not actually look at some of that metadata for a while. Maybe it's quarterly, maybe it's, you know, annually even. So I think a lot of people, when you're having those conversations to say, I need you in your role to create this metadata for me, and they don't see that immediate impact, you know, it'll wane, right? So it's always just keeping an eye on it, having that conversation, and then showing the why.
No, that makes total sense. And being consistent and like, yeah, I know you don't see the value necessarily see the value today, but like on the QBRs or our monthly reviews, you're gonna want this, like trust me almost. Like it's not just trust me, like you have to show and prove, but like making that case and building that trust.
Yeah. And the question I always like to pose is so how are you going to prove, or how are you going to show your return when the questions are asked, right?
Yes, exactly. And then it's thinking through that. But then it's also letting people like yourself figure out. It's like get the execs or the stakeholders to bring requirements and what they need to prove or show their work or whatever, and then let smart people figure it out and lead the discussion. Because like that's another thing. It's like your CMO doesn't need to be doing that. That's what a great ops person and a great ops team does.
Yeah, exactly.
Biggest one thing, anybody on the line that wants to ask questions, pop it in the comments. I'll make sure we ask a question. So don't be shy. Biggest learning, like if you're like what's one thing that maybe you stubbed your toe on that you can help people avoid doing the same thing, or something that you look back and you said, man, that was a great decision. I would do that 100% again.
So I mean, there's always that constant debate on the value of attribution. Some people, you know, some people believe in it, some people don't. I think for us, it was definitely a good decision. It's something that I would do again. I think that you know, there's a lot wrapped up in attribution and modeling and looking at what's going on from touch point perspective. But then also, you know, marketing attribution is very much a marketing construct. So those conversations can leak outside of marketing. And I think that's where there can be some challenges with people understanding, like, what are you even talking about? But I think, you know, some of the learnings that we had and some of the hiccups that we've had is thinking through all of the complexities. So for example, when you are thinking through attribution to an event, do you, you know, how much time do you sort of leave at the tail end to say, I'm still going to attribute it back to the event, versus somebody goes to an event 3 days later, they hit the website. Now you're like, oh my God, the website's on fire. Was it driven by the event? So thinking through a lot of those different scenarios is a lot. And the learning is like, you're never going to get it 100% right off the bat. So you have to have your wits about you and the flexibility to understand. I know a lot of people that have gone on that attribution journey, like a year later, still not confident in what's going on. So it's being very upfront and managing some of those expectations, but then also I think making sure that you've got a safe space inside of marketing and to experiment, to learn, to share those insights without going larger across the organization, because it's a very different conversation that you should be having in your marketing team around attribution, and then talking to sales about what is the impact of marketing. Like, those are two very different things that I think oftentimes get wrapped up into one, and can cause a little bit of confusion.
I think that's a great point, and I think that like there's a couple questions coming in, and I almost want to shift to that back. I said we come back to RevOps, and now we're there. Yes, I love when that happens naturally. When like I absolutely agree. The conversation about marketing and metrics and attribution or ROI should be different inside the four walls of marketing versus outside. What suggestions do you have for other folks or other ops or marketers when you're talking to the CFO, the head of sales, the CEO, whomever about marketing ROI?
Yeah.
And particularly now, as you're someone who oversees more than just marketing ops.
I think when you are talking outside of marketing, so if you're talking about with finance or even sales, I think you kind of have to simplify things a little bit. So, again, if you're talking in marketing with attribution, you're talking journey, touch points, return to pipeline, those sorts of things. I think when you're talking to finance, there's a bit of a shift and a bit of a simplification to say, here's our bucket that we're spending on brand, and here's our bucket that we're spending on demand. And then here is what we are going to say the intent behind those two things are. And here's the one or two things that we're measuring to indicate if performance is going as expected. So like, they don't need to understand what's driving your, I don't know, lead create, touch point. They don't need to understand a lot of those different components and the granularity that you get inside of marketing. But they will need to understand sort of that high level. If I'm giving you, because finance will want to know, if I'm giving you $1, what are you giving me back? So at a very high level, kind of thinking through what those conversations are with finance, where you're not digging into the complexity.
Have you seen finance push back, particularly if they want, like if they're saying, if I'm giving you $1, what am I going to get out of it? Like, have you seen them push back when it comes to, well, the intent of X is for demand, and I can give you $1 for $1 pipeline, but the intent for Y is brand, and it's a bit less,
I haven't seen pushback per se. I have seen frustration, right? Because I think, brand is something that's very hard to measure. And brand could be a lot of that activity that is going to have, again, downstream impact. So if we're spending a lot of time, money, effort, resources on brand, like, is there that halo effect where we're starting to see deals move faster, we're seeing close rates increase? That's really hard to measure. So I think the pushback more is on the operations group to say, we have to simplify, like, you're spending on brand. Here are the couple of things that we can measure as leading indicators, but brand is a bit nebulous to kind of look at. So, I mean, you can measure things like, reputation, awareness, web traffic, those sorts of things, to kind of indicate that effort is yielding something. But finance wants to sink their teeth into something. So you got to give them something, but I think it's a bit more of a simplification and just a conversation around what that looks like.
That's great. So if I would even like kind of summarize, it's like you want to simplify when you're bringing it outside of marketing, lead with intent, but not just intent, but the intent on how it affects the business, and have something, but it's okay to acknowledge things that are like harder versus things that are a little softer. And harder and softer means like hard facts versus soft facts. Is that pretty good summarization?
Yeah, I think so.
Beautiful. Okay, RevOps. What does that look like? We've got a couple more minutes. So like, what does that look like in your organization? Like, what's your purview now that it's not just marketing ops?
Yeah, it's so RevOps. I mean, we started it actually probably right about a year ago. And the mandate really was alignment. I would say the initial alignment, just to get consistency again around how we're looking at reporting, how we're looking at our data, having some governance over our data strategy, and really looking at sort of lead to revenue processes. So certainly cross-functional. I think RevOps being fairly new, there's a lot of different ways it's being structured in organizations, a lot of different intent behind the org. We are really looking at it as a cross-functional group. So in terms of the team structure, we've got marketing operations, we've got sales operations, we've got an analytics or insight arm. We are soon to have some enablement resources on the team as well. And then we also do have inside sales that is sitting in our RevOps team right now.
Awesome. Has this made reporting and ROI and all of that easier, or is it still the same old kind of challenges?
That's a loaded question. So it hasn't made it easier. I think in some aspects, yes, because now our purview is really full funnel, like looking at everything, even into growth and expansion. But I think it's also layered on additional complexities, because now your purview really is the entire tech stack. Yep. So in marketing, you had the complexities of marketing, but you're really just focused on managing that MarTech stack, and how you're running your program operations. But now, now we're layering in, like, we've got RevOps has governance over our CRM. Now we're starting to look at some of the tools and tech that CS is using.
Yep.
And when you grow very quickly as a business, that infrastructure isn't necessarily set up with scale in mind, right? Yeah. It's very quick to market, grow fast, just get things to market. So trying to get and look at that data strategy, making sure, again, metadata is coming through across and there's consistency. That layers on a whole other level of complexity. So I think it's made our world more complex, but it's also given us a little bit more authority across the full funnel to make sure that we are building and scaling for the future.
Awesome, that's helpful. Last question, and it's kind of, somebody commented, don't use the word credit when talking about attribution. It's a trigger word for sales. Now that you're, again, not just, you got revenue ops, what advice do you have to marketers around that sales alignment, particularly when it comes to ROI and performance as a whole, now that you're literally the kind of layer on top, or the connective glue?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Like, when I sort of hear that word credit, that makes me cringe a little bit. I think, sourced versus influence also is a little bit of a difficult conversation, or terms to use with sales, because it becomes, it just fosters that us versus them mentality. So my advice, I think, really, it kind of comes back to what we've been talking about the whole time, right? Like, what is the intent of what we're doing here? So, if we're talking about a program, if we have a very clear understanding of like what the intent is, what we're driving towards, and then think of it more collectively as a unit. So it's not marketing saying, I'm going to run this. Now my expectation, sales, is you're going to generate the money. Like, I want you to give me back, 8 million in pipe, right? Like, I'm running my event, I want 8 million in pipe. It's really having a bit more of a comprehensive conversation around how collectively, again, layering on the complexity that it's not just the one program that impacts pipeline. So how are we all working collectively together to get the journey moving faster?
Awesome. Well, this has been great, Richard. A lot of good information. Again, we have Allocadia has another one of these interviews that we just recently did with Lori West, who's VP of Marketing, Ops, and Technology over at Genpact. Great resource here with Richard. There's other information out there. I think again, where I kind of started with my introduction here is ROI is not a one size fit all kind of journey. So get information from these experts, work with your trusted partners who have done this with multiple different customers, and learn and figure out what the right path for you is. For some folks, X may work, some folks Y may work. But this has been great, really insightful, and I've learned some. So thank you, Richard, as always. Thanks everyone for joining us.